At the age of 21, the protagonist named Rosalita was finally able to show the world a research paper called The Process of Lightning Magic under the name Rosalita. In this novel, Rosalita is the most beautiful, polite, endowed with a pleasant personality, intelligent and ingenious character, and part-time protagonist. She was the one lying on her younger sister's bed eating potato chips while sitting on her phone. She became a character in the novel by the adorable 16-year-old Rosalita. Also in this novel, Asterion Blue Starry Sky, as the title suggests, the main character is Asterion. It is in the novel that he is with the aquatic younger brother of the protagonist, with a gentle appearance and malleable character, a sweet young man who listens for his sister in everything. He has such an angelic face now, but he used to live with the servants, so although he is the girl's younger brother, he is not really her younger brother. Rosalita knows the ending of this novel well. Even since childhood, Asterion's life has been miserable. As a result, their pessimistic heroes fell into despondency. And at the beautiful age of 20, he firmly decided to shorten his life and actually left this world. It's a terrible ending, to be honest. But since this is an old novel, it is worth the audience to think about the conditions of this era, and everything becomes more or less clear. But in any case, Rosalita is just one of the secondary characters. Watching the life of Asterion just could not pass by. Only she will support her brother. The main character watched the guy and wished him luck. So the girl lived helping her brother from day to day. And at the age of 20, Asterion died. And the protagonist again became a 16-year-old Rosalita. The girl had a second attempt. At first, Rosalita denied reality, but then she decided to pull herself together. It seems that if Asterion dies, the protagonist's life will begin anew, which means Asterion must try not to die. So Rosalita helped him, comforting and chasing away suitors. But thanks to a suitor beyond imagination, the girl was 16 years old Rosalita again. The girl was on her third try. She focused on raising Asterion to be strong, and if he could stand up for himself, then he wouldn't have to put up with suitors together or their other actions. And of course, Asterion became a master swordsman. But the guy decided that he failed again, and the protagonist had a fourth attempt. Rosalita took care of her brother comprehensively. She was kind enough to keep him from deciding to die. In all her life, Asterion had never once lost. So Rosalita, deciding it would make him vulnerable, sent him to school to be a knight. And so Asterion turned 20 years old, and only his ashes came back. When the girl had her fifth try, she half gave up and just raised her brother so that at least he wouldn't have to deal with the vile attitude. But even so, no matter what she did, Asterion would still die. However, Asterion celebrated his 21st birthday. At the birthday party, the protagonist threw herself into her brother's arms and thanked him for being alive. But suddenly, a guy who was mad at Asterion came in and pierced him with his sword. Because of this, the main idea didn't have a sixth try. Rosalita thought about the fact that this time would definitely only be a training session. Asterion is now an expert, and decided to train so that he wouldn't die, instead of her. That's how Rosalita joined the Magic Tower. The protagonist had no ability to control various elements, but surprisingly, she turned out to be a lightning mage. Even if Asterion died again and the loop formed, the girl's knowledge and magic would remain. She lived in the Magic Tower without a trace. Although Rosalita constantly unstopped the 16-year-old, but her interest in magic gradually began to ignite. So the protagonist's interest and will to live. The girl said that life is magic, what begins with magic already and ends. Then the magician sitting next to the protagonist said it was time for this conversation, and he confessed that he was actually over 100 years old. And from the moment the mana circles get over 6, the aging process slows down. So he kept lying that he was 50 years old. The protagonist was glad that magic was always revealing something new to her, and she found happiness within the novel, and for the first time in her life, she knew the joy of learning. The Tower of Magic really proved to be her arena. Magic is the best there is, and very interesting. The mana circles are now 2.5, so Rosalita could finally use the spell, but Asterion was dead again, and the protagonist had her 10th attempt. Then she revealed to the world a research paper, The Process of the Origin of Magic and Lightning, called Rosalita. The protagonist was told it was an amazing piece of work, The protagonist's teacher showed up. He said he was proud of the girl. When Rosalita wanted to hug him, it turned out that she was reborn again. And so began her 11th attempt. On her 11th try, Rosalita got a date. Raising Asterion was easy. Even after reaching his 20th birthday, he had a healthy mouth and started a relationship. The protagonist now only had to marry and leave this house and run away to the magic tower. It seemed to the girl that everything was going perfectly. And now she and her boyfriend are a family, so they will be fine. The main character, together with her fiancé, were drinking lemonade. Suddenly, Asterion came up to them. Rosalita said that it was a special lemonade made by her maid. But Asterion replied that if it was a family, he was also a family, so he wanted to share the lemonade with them. The guy promised to take just one sip. But it turned out that the boy drank all the lemonade. Rosalita got mad and started yelling that if he was going to get in the way, then he'd better go for a walk. But it turned out that Asterion drank poison instead of the main character. The girl began her 12th attempt. Rosalita became a 16-year-old girl again. The fact that everything had returned to its original position made her very angry. She attacked her brother and started yelling at him. But Rosalita realized it wasn't Asterion's fault. The protagonist didn't want to give up. In this life, she even hired teachers for her brother and now promised to definitely save his life. A few years later, Asterion was at a tea party with Gary. Gary said that tea has a good flavor, and if you enjoy the flavor of tea like that, you won't see anyone die. And Gary did die. Asterion didn't understand how it happened. Gary had said at the last moment that it was me, but Asterion couldn't believe it because he was fine. He seemed to be the only one with resistance to the poison. The protagonist was glad that she had succeeded, and now her little brother was strong. She went to the magic tower. The protagonist brought her thesis, and sheets of paper were thrown at the girl. The teacher asked how Rosalita could name what she brought the thesis. Again, a few years later, a thesis was thrown at the main character again, and asked how she could call it a thesis. Rosalita promised to write the thesis again and come back. She asked, would the teacher still continue to swear then? The teacher replied that Rosalita is a silly girl. Does she still like magic after being yelled at? When the protagonist was in her room on her bed, a comrade came to her and said that the girl's trouble had switched and she had to get up immediately. The protagonist replied that the comrade is finished if this news is nothing special. And then the protagonist heard a fellow shouting to the master of the true magic tower to give him his sister. When Rosalita went out into the corridor, she saw her brother fighting with the master of the tower. And at that moment, the tower master killed Asterion. Something inside the protagonist at that moment seemed to snap. And then came the 13th attempt. Everything went wrong again. Since this life Rosalita lived as a person with disabilities, she does not know how Asterion lived afterwards. But she's back to square one, which means somehow he's dead. And so came the 14th attempt. The protagonist decided to die peacefully. Asterion's path is dark, but she did everything she could. But then came the 15th attempt, and Rosalita cried non-stop because she was dying and the end would not come. After that, all she remembers is crying. And then came her 16th try, and then it was time for her 20th try. Her body was as sweet as if it had been hibernating, and after that day, there was a strong urge to go look in the mirror. And that's when Rosalita first encountered that her body is not 16. It was more mature. The protagonist didn't understand how it happened. But suddenly the protagonist saw the annex, where Asterion lives. She felt threatened and jumped out of the window. Habit really is a terrible thing. Even so, Rosalita ran out, but Asterion eventually died and came back again. Rosalita knew nothing but couldn't contain her curiosity. If anything went wrong, she'd just die. And she'd already died, so she didn't see it as a big deal. Rosalita went to the cellar. There was an elaborate lock. Something like this is too easy for her. The girl used magic to open this door. When the protagonist stepped inside, she saw in front of her a huge sword that was forged with chains. It's a magical sword with terrible dark energy. In a novel where love is supposed to reign, this is the first time such a frightening and suspicious object appears. A normal person would never touch it, but for the protagonist, all is lost, so she decides to give it a try. When Rosalita touched the sword, she found herself in an empty space. But suddenly the sword appeared in front of the protagonist. Contractor basis, Rosalita Roseberg, If realize the wish of the contract again, destroy. Then the protagonist realized that Rosalita was her. It turned out that Rosalita Roseberg, 23825 days ago, died as payment for the contract, and the girl only has a soul most similar to Rosalita's. Substitute. The protagonist thought it was about 65 years ago, and that's when she first became Rosalita. The protagonist is told that she was summoned after the death of Rosalita Roseberg, and according to the subjective flow of time, 23825 days have passed. The village did not realize whether it had anything to do with her being constantly reborn. Lissa replied that his answer was positive. Then the protagonist suggested that if Rosalita's wish was granted, this round of deaths of 16-year-old Rosalita de Koff would end. The sword replied that it would. But then the protagonist asked how his wish for Rosalita was already granted, but the sword replied that it was the fulfillment of Asterian's wish. The protagonist inquired, "What is the guy's wish?" But the sword replied that it is unknown, and it is impossible to find out. The protagonist replied that the sword was useless. Then he took offense at her. He said that when the stress counteractor and its associated subconstituent reach their limit, the basics explode. The protagonist asked why he was talking about it now. Rosalita went to the ruined ruins. Suddenly, Asterian appeared behind the protagonist's back and asked why the girl pulled out the sword. Now the girl tries to understand if her brother fought with her. Asterian cried and said that from the beginning he didn't need anything but his sister. For some reason, Asterian had been glued to the main character like gum from a long time ago. Asterian admitted that he loved his sister. Ever since he was a child, he had been in awe of her alone. The protagonist was shocked by this turn of events. She lost consciousness and bled to death. And the protagonist had 21 attempts. Outside the window was a blue sky, and it was noon on the clock. The maid was getting ready for the dinner parties. The protagonist was glad that she had regained her calm 16 years of age. At the age of the protagonist trying her best, young people look very cute. Among the three of them, especially bright maid Becky, also she is quick to do her job. That must be why the relatives sent her as a spy. After all, she is the one who added the lemon poison. Rosalita could die so many times because of her Asterian even died once. The maid was ordered by the protagonist to bring Aster. The protagonist told the maid that it was a great job, but now Bucky was fired. The maid didn't understand why Rosalita said that to her. But the maid left. This parting brings tears to the eyes of the protagonist, but it's not Becky who matters now. For outside the door of her room stood Aster Brown. Aster is a knight 3 times formerly in charge of guarding the protagonist and protecting the girl to the end. He is strong and good at his job. He is the protagonist's loyal knight. Aster tells the protagonist that many people have misunderstandings if they introduce themselves in this way. Rosalita replies that it's even personal. Apparently, she likes praise more than anyone else. Just as Rosalita finished writing, and from now on, Aster is her knight. At that moment, the maid brought the younger mistress, Mr. Dillon. The protagonist allowed the lad to enter her room. Dillon Diamond, the protagonist's cousin and bully. Dillon inquired, "Why on earth did Rosalita?" and called out. The protagonist replied that she was calling her cousin to tell him that he would soon be banished from the town. Dillon asks in surprise, "What on earth are these sudden threats? Has the girl finally lost her mind?" Rosalita replies that she may have lost her mind, but only Dillon is the rapist. The girl found out everything Dillon did. The protagonist promised to tell Uncle Leus about all the guy's actions. Not if the guy thinks about it, and Rosalita advises him to pack his things in advance and disappear. Dillon got angry and left the protagonist's room, but Rosalita realized that there is no mercy for a low and pathetic man like Dillon. Now it's official. She's bringing Asterian. After she tells her uncle about Dillon's outrage, she can erase him from the family registry. Sister's working hard for her little brother. Aster asked if the protagonist was okay. But Rosalita didn't know what the knight was talking about. But the knight assumed that Dillon could take revenge. The protagonist replied that a man who was always sneaking around behind his back would never have such a thought. Besides, it is enough for the knight to protect his mistress as hard as he is paid. Suddenly, a maid from the palace named Olivia burst into the room. She said there was trouble. She wanted to tell about Mr. Dillon and Asterian, but the protagonist forbade the maid to talk about it. Rosalita said that if the maid's clan will be tightly closed count or will not be able to find out what happened. Rosalita said that's only if Asterion is still okay. But suddenly, the maid bit the protagonist's hand and said that everyone has a right to know about it. And it turned out that Asterion was dead. The protagonist had her 22nd attempt. When Rosalita woke up, she ordered her younger brother to be brought to her first, the second son of Uncle Leus, her father's own younger brother. This is Dylan. The protagonist wanted to use her killing techniques that had accumulated over 65 years of life, various secrets of death based on personal experience. If Rosalita uses it all, she'll give her cousin the worst possible death. After a while, Asterion was in front of the protagonist. Rosalita asked, "Who does the boy look like? The hair and eye shape is charming and rounded. Putting a hand to it, the brother's appearance would be simply adorable. Charm is also talent. As far as what is worth dying for, how beautiful it is." Rosalita congratulated Asterion for now being a member of the ducal family. You can see from the boy's face that he's confused. But to grow up beautiful and healthy is his mission. And from now on, his brother has nothing to worry about. So from now on, whoever dares to touch the protagonist's brother will be finished. Rosalita took the boy to meet the Duke. A bad partner is defined as the male characters that Asterion at least once matched with in the work Asterion of the Blue Starry Sky. Because the center of the novel's narrative is a constant annoying failure, most of the characters here are no better than trash. There's at least a bad but better partner to be thankful for. After all, it's already clear that the most first-rate trash of all is Dylan Diamond. Since this partner is impertinent and unbearable, he dares to provoke the protagonist, thereby causing her anger. The protagonist decides to just tell how she is going to get rid of this guy this time. The protagonist's first step is to tell her father. The father is Duke Edward Larissa. His specialty is that he's always busy. The Duke is holding a piece of paper that says they must make Asterion a member of Larissa's family. Dylan is to be punished. When Dylan heard that he didn't understand, has Rosalita gone mad? But the protagonist said that if she's stupid, then the office she's in is a trash can. If this office is a trash can, then the Duke is trash too, Rosalita asks in surprise. Is Dylan saying that the Duke is trash? The Duke agrees with his daughter's words and orders Dylan's execution. The training of Asterion can begin immediately. As for the execution of this rapist, all it takes is the approval of the Leus. Now the protagonist asks how Dylan will act, but he's angry. The guy doesn't understand. Is this really how it's gonna end? He'll pay his enemies back tenfold. He pulls out his dagger and wants to stab the main character. But then Aster shows up and knocks the dagger out of the guy's hands. Now Aster asks what the guy will do. The protagonist asks in surprise, "Did she really bring the knight for beauty?" She orders Aster to break his arms and legs, so he can't do anything stupid from now on. The protagonist's second step was to denounce Uncle Louis and get his approval. Uncle Louis Diamant is Dylan's father. He asked the protagonist what it was all about. The protagonist pounced on her uncle and said that she was going to possess absolutely everything her uncle owned. Those are the exact words of her younger brother's bullying Dylan should be executed. The protagonist easily succeeded in everything. It was so easy for her to kill a bad partner. After a while, Rosalita came out to the night, and Aster asked why the girl came so quickly. After all, she was going to taste a pork cutlet on the way. The protagonist replied that she was just very capable. Suddenly, a man approached the protagonist. He overheard Rosalita talking about Dylan's execution. He says that he may seem impertinent to the girl, but he asks her to reconsider. He doesn't know what sin Dylan committed, but he's willing to make amends. He asked for the mistress. Rosalita noticed the guy had his leg and his staff. Rosalita realized it was definitely Glenn Hofen. And now the protagonist wants to see the family tree of the House of Diamant. Uncle Louis's ex-wife died and he remarried. The child born to the previous husband of the current Marquise Diamant of his second wife is Glenn Hofen. In short, a non-existent son of the family. Therefore, it is absolutely that the eldest son of the previous wife, Benjamin, and even the child born from Uncle Louis, his younger brother, bullied him. The result of this abuse is his mangled leg. But even so, Dylan's existence is necessary for Glenn Hofen, the official number 2 of the Marquis of Diamant, in other words, his life and the life of the current Marquis, and depend on the official heir Benjamin. If Dylan dies, It is obvious that the position of the Marquis under the protection of his shadow will be very depressing. And Glenn and his mother's life will be like a candle flame. If you think about it, he's got a very hard life. Rosalita doesn't understand if Glenn Hofen isn't an innocent victim of the Marquis of Diamant's truly horrible bloodline. Rosalita agrees to show leniency. Glenn Hofen asks the bear, "Is it really true?" But Rosalita replies that she was joking. The heroine gets into the carriage, but Glenn Hofen tries to stop her. He asks the lady for another chance. He's sincere, and maybe Dylan just made a mistake. Rosalita asks what mistake can be made in harassment, and the manner of Glenn Hofen's petition was wrong from the start. Rosalita asks, "Aren't you all non-aggression of nitpicking again?" Glenn Hofen does not understand what the girl is saying, but Rosalita answers that judging from the way Glenn Hofen got inflamed, he had no intention of doing that. Rosalita asks the guy to listen carefully. She says that when he asks someone for a favor and bowing his head first is a show of etiquette. At this point, the protagonist says goodbye to the guy. She says that either way, Dylan is going to die. She wishes the guy luck in surviving in the Marquis's house. Perhaps now, for the first time in her life, Glenn Hofen thinks that even girls like this exist. Though he's a non-existent son after all, he's also an aristocrat who thinks he'll never go down on his knees. And it's the thought that he wants to live destroyed in just 24 hours. Hours before Glenn Hofen bent his precious noble knees. Whether someone disappeared or not, the members of the duchy would still continue their work. Junior Master Asterion came to the main character. Asterion addressed the younger mistress in the grace of God for many years, and prosperous he wished her hello forever. Asked who is even saying that now? She said to her brother to just wish her good morning and call her sister. Rosalita asks, "Did Asterion come here without even eating breakfast? Such a handsome boy should be given at least one banana." But when the protagonist wanted to do it, Aster stopped her and said that it was his banana. Rosalita was surprised and asked, "Since when?" But Aster replies that his banana is signed. Rosalita replies that she can't see it. But Aster replies that the heart of the protagonist is not capable of seeing it. Rosalita turns to her brother and asks that he tell the maid to bring more. And Asterion can eat it in peace. And Aster has a lot of people in the house, hence his gluttony. The main character showed 100,002,000 portraits. Asterion asked what it was. The protagonist replied that it is the number of candidates for brides of the crown prince who recommend them. Rosalita orders her to pick some pretty good girls, but the protagonist replies that she does all sorts of nonsense. But the protagonist knows that besides the prince of this country is bad partner number 3, who someday must also fall in love with Asterion, and his name is Theodore with the laughing face. Since this man's actions are completely out of common sense, the protagonists need to marry him, and then their Asterion will be safe. Suddenly, a maid comes in to see the protagonist, who addresses the younger mistress, saying that Diamant is asking for a meeting. He's come from the Duchy of Dylan. Namaju replies that he died this morning. She orders him to be summoned, and back to the present. Glenn Hofen kneels before the protagonist and says he wants to live. Rosalita decides to pick up where she left off. A few hours later, the protagonist continued to look at the pictures. Glenn Hofen was still kneeling. Asterion and Aster were feeling awkward. Suddenly, Aster asked Mistress, "And is this normal?" Asterion also asked for his sister to listen to the man, but the protagonist asked, "Does her brother really have anything to say?" Knight and Asterion understood everything, so they didn't turn to their sister anymore. But after some time, Asterion asks his sister in surprise, "Is it possible that she too will become a candidate for the prince's bride?" Rosalita replies that this is nonsense, just uttered by her brother's mouth. But Asterion replies to his sister that it is true. At this point, he shows the protagonist her portrait as well. It's a recommendation. The girl is recommended in case the crown prince is bored to death with life. Rosalita snatches her brother's portrait and asks who recommended it. Asterion replies that Uncle Luis did. And at that moment, the protagonist throws her portrait at the head of Glenn Hofen, who is sitting next to her. Rosalita starts to get angry, saying that they have completely lost their minds. Again, a few hours later, Glenn Hofen is still on his knees. The kind of Glenn Hofen was noted by Asterion as an incredibly persistent man, Aster as an unhappy man. But no one knows what Rosalita was thinking. The protagonist talked about how it was getting late, and it was time for her to go to bed. She called the maid and ordered the kneeling bronze statue to be brought to the guest room, and to send Jean Brown and 3 servants to the Marquis Diamant. That way, they won't commit useless murders and feel the influence of the Roxburghs. Glenhofen begins to thank my lady. But at that moment, Rosalita says that Glenhofen can do absolutely nothing on his own. She calls him pathetic and says that if he'll only have her to call him off. Now the girl orders the guy out of her sight, this time a few days later. The main character says that apparently Asterion is doing well in school. That's commendable, all thanks to the young master's body constitution. Aster asks if the protagonist has heard the news that Glenhofen officially wants to send his thanks. After all, he still seems to think he's something. Aster says that Mistress said so and ended up helping him anyway, and making him suffer for nothing. The protagonist replies that Glenhofen is entertaining. She's already ridiculously cute, that he thinks there's some good in his lap. Aster talks about Rosalita being a complicated pervert, and if she keeps doing this to him, he'll quit. Suddenly, the protagonist sees a carriage in the window. Aster says it's a luxury carriage. He wonders who it is. Rosalita replies that judging by the fact that the carriage is covered in gold, it's a royal carriage. And there's only one reason a royal carriage can come. Rosalita starts yelling for Aster to run away. At that moment, the knight picks up the protagonist and starts to run away with her in his arms. The knight asks why this is necessary. Rosalita replies that it's an invitation to a ball. There are balls that are held periodically to find the crown princess. And if you get an invitation to this evening, then officially the girl can rest from her duties. Except that another person who doesn't have such privileges will have to deal with the girl's job with absolutely everything. The protagonist shouts to the knight that if even she dies, she is obliged to get it. The knight agrees with the mistress. The knight in the arms of the protagonist is already running into the corridor, but suddenly they are stopped by the Duke. The Duke orders his butler to deal with it. Rosalita now orders the guard to let her go. And at that moment, the butler and the lady's knight begin to fight. At that moment, the protagonist begins to run after the Duke. She says that her father is running slowly. She asks, "Is it because he is already too old?" Hertz yells for the daughter to be more respectful to her parent. At that moment, he hits the girl in the face with his hand and breaks her nose. Rosalita falls to her knees. Herzog says that it's over. He didn't mean to bring it to this. After all, he's only doing this for his daughter. He promises to bring a stepmother who will do a good job. He asks her to take care of the rest. But suddenly, Rosalita hits her father. She screams that he's got the stimulus laser kick. For a moment, the idea of her mother seems tempting to the protagonist. But there is no hope in her. She wishes the Duke well in writing, at least a letter of remorse for the mother. At this moment, the protagonist goes outside. A man comes out of an arriving carriage to give the lady a message. At that moment, the knight Aster appears behind the mistress. He tells her that the Duke's butler is finished. The next day, Rosalita, comfortably rested, looked superb. The maid said that the younger mistress was beautiful. You can't take your eyes off her. But at that moment, Aster speaks of a pearl necklace hanging around the pig's neck. Rosalita asks, "Is the knight mocking her?" But the knight replies that he likes pigs. After all, they're delicious. After a while, they set off on their journey and arrived in no time. The knight asks, had they come too soon? But Rosalita replies that they came just in time. Aster realizes the mistress is up to something again, but of course she is. By catching the servant and bribing him, the protagonist will be able to advance, to scout out the situation at the royal palace. She's going to make a good impression on the minds of the people who come here. A man shows up. He says he hasn't seen Madame in a long time. This is Crown Prince Theodore Allen. His specialty is spitting poison with a smiling face. And his hobby is picking fights with the 4 Grand Dukes. The prince says he's been waiting a long time to meet his mistress. Moreover, this character requires special caution because in time, unknown attempts he brought Asterion as a crown princess and turned the royal court upside down. Suddenly, Rosalita turns to the knight and tells Aster not to say anything from now on. The man just laughed. Aster agrees with the words of his mistress. Rosalita asks if the crown prince is in good health. He must have been looking forward to her arrival. Theodore replies that every day he receives letters demanding that he marry as soon as possible, so he was genuinely worried if the lady's hand had broken while writing them. Knight Aster begins to laugh. And Rosalita replies that if His Highness has long since passed the age of marriage and runs away from the old bachelor's engagement, there too. If the arm breaks, everything will be all right. Theodore replies that despite the girl's words and looking at the beautiful like white jade hand apparently, she managed to find a substitute to write the letters. Even after her death, Theodore will continue to receive letters. Aster continues to laugh. Rosalita replies that this is certainly true, but she says that the Duchy of Larissa, whose patronage extends to the royal palace, cannot protect one young life in full bloom. Theodore starts laughing and says that he'll leave it at that. The prince walks away from the protagonist. The main character was surprised, because she expected the guy would have no shame. Suddenly, Theodora says that if you remember, he had something to say to the lady. Rosalita didn't even want to hear the prince's words, and realized that Theodore is a stubborn man. His name is Aster Brown. He's attending the ball as Lady Rosalita's personal knight, and he's happy. The food in the Duchy of Larissa is quite good, but the kitchen of the royal castle is overflowing with rare and expensive delicacies. Hard won, right by bloodshed, Aster starved from yesterday to make the most of it. Aster asks what dishes Mistress wants to start with. For first, necessarily, Aster is going to reap a fat piece of meat. Rosalita replies to let the knight do as he knows how. Aster wonders why Mistress looks so emaciated, but it makes no difference. After all, she has always gone beyond the knight's imagination. This has nothing to do with her, so once she's dealt with the gluttonous fellows, then everything will change. After a while, the knight and the protagonist entered the castle. They were greeted by the prince's servants, and announced that representatives of the Duchy of Larissa had arrived. All the guests were surprised that Lady Larissa had arrived, and they all rushed to the lady. They asked how the health of her mother and father was. But at that moment, the knight was crazy about what was happening. She shouted for everyone to move aside. The aristocrats' children came to tonight's ball, all bums and those with time on their hands. How dare they talk to the main character, Lady Duke, so they decided to stick it to the soft knight. Rosalita runs off to eat, and she promises the knight to leave a review of these magnificent meals later. After all, she went to eat. Suddenly, a prince approached the protagonist, who asked if the girl would allow him to invite her to one dance. But at one point, Rosalita splashed her hand into the soup and said that her hand was in a terrible state. Would it be difficult to dance with it? But the prince asks if the hand is not enough. Just wipe it. Or, does scratching every day with strange letters make the lady's body stiff? The protagonist doesn't understand why this guy is so clingy despite his hatred of Mistress. Rosalita replies that it's not that she's not confident in her dancing abilities. Rather, she's afraid that the prince will start fragrant with food because of her. The prince says that Rosalita is his last partner, so it's all right. He offers to do just one dance. The prince tells the lady that he has heard there is a new family member in the duchy. Rosalita realizes the prince is talking about her younger brother. She wants Theodore to finish talking about it. After all, accidents are more undesirable in a true romance. The girl doesn't understand. Is there something in the prince's way if he can't set up a connection? Is the bad partner number 3 already smells the prey and is approaching? Rosalita is ready to kill him, but she laughs at the prince and tells him that Asterion is handsome and very kind to her, and if the prince touches him, she will make not only the prince, but the whole world regret it. Theodore replies that my lady is so zealous in protecting Asterion that he is even more curious. The protagonist says that His Highness the Prince definitely has a sister as well as a younger one, and if he wants to keep harmony among the families, she asks to behave more discreetly. Theodore asks, "Isn't there anything Rosalita isn't afraid to say?" The protagonist replies that if the prince feels injustice, he must be born in the next life a member of the royal family in a country with a strong royal right. Theodore responds that this is a magnificent mastery. It's hard for him to imagine this dumb body sitting in his doghouse every day. Rosalita thanks the prince. In turn, she says that the prince's hand on her waist was shaking so much, and she was already thinking that the hand had a vibration mode. So the girl concluded that the prince's muscles are quite decrepit. Rosalita gets angry and leaves the prince. But at that moment, she notices that Asterion is gone. He had spoken so sweetly of wanting to go together, that if Rosalita had been influenced by her younger brother and brought him to this place, He would have only met with a bad partner for nothing. And now Rosalita is relieved. The protagonist starts calling for her knight. The knight asks his mistress if he can have a fight with her. After all, she was intent on abandoning him, and just used him. Rosalita asks the knight to let her get away with it, because she had no choice. After all, she came to save him anyway. Rosalita shows the knight a lot of food. Aster replies that she's been waiting for it. Anyway, since Aster grew up in a house with a lot of people, it is possible to bribe her with food. Rosalita decides to rest here for the time being. After all, her father is buried under a mountain of papers. Rosalita asks if the knight is well. She assumes Aster doesn't want to go home. The knight asks what they will do. Rosalita decides to show the knight by hand what is interesting. At this time, Theodore asks, does the protagonist still have any threats left for him? He tells Rosalita to finish up and come back. Rosalita talks about tonight. Tonight she doesn't want to go back. The prince asks, has my lady gone mad after the duke? Rosalita doesn't understand. Did her father do such a thing? Rosalita offers to pay for the knight's lodging. But Theodore shouts for Rosalita to stop. After all, he is disgusted that Rosalita is pretending to be flirtatious with him. Rosalita asks, is he really disgusted by it? Because apparently he's never seen a truly disgusting thing. Theodore replies that it's disgusting then. But Rosalita asks if these are not the words he says every day when he looks in the mirror in the morning. Theodore replies to his mistress that he never said that. He asks where Rosalita is going to follow him. The protagonist replies that she is going to sing a lullaby in the prince's bed. Theodore shouts for the company to be escorted to the guest room immediately. Now the protagonist and her knight are escorted into the room. The knight is surprised that Rosalita does not give up at all. But suddenly passing by, Aster notices that one of the rooms has something. The knight tells the protagonist that there seems to be something here. But Rosalita can't sense anything. She decides to use the scan. But that's when she realizes there really is something, for it feels like some kind of power. Now the protagonist, together with the knight, goes to that place. At first glance, it's just an ordinary room. But what doesn't bother the protagonist is that this room is right under the prince's chambers. This room has been locked. The knight asks the lady to leave. Rosalita doesn't understand why this is necessary. But at that moment, Aster tries to break through the doors with his fist. But Rosalita asks the knight to calm down. And at that moment, the mistress orders the maid to fetch the court magician. Aster asks why Rosalita should do this. But the protagonist replies that it's because she's better than Aster. She asks Aster to step aside. After all, the protagonist only has the first circle of power, so she should focus. It's been a long time since Rosalita used magic. All she has to do is open a locked door. But when she used magic, she had a slight sense of déjà vu. The girl did it. She tells the knights to come in. Aster asks, is it really magic? Aster asks if the duke knows about it, but Rosalita replies that there is nothing to know. She orders the knight to go through that door as quickly as possible. Aster finds himself inside that room. Rosalita asks what is in there. Aster sees a cursed doll. The energy is close to either black magic or the spirit realm, but the size of the doll is quite small. It is only powerful enough to cause a heaviness in the shoulders or fatigue in the eyes. The doll is not designed to kill the prince. And Rosalita wondered why Theodore looked so tired he hadn't danced more than one dance. Now Rosalita understood everything. Suddenly, a magician appears and asks, did the Duchess call her? The magician was frightened. Rosalita asks why the magician is so surprised. Is he the culprit who hid the doll? But Mac replies that it's not him by any means. But Rosalita asks why the magician is so frightened. Also, the main heroine says that if the palace found such a thing can be very, very big trouble. However, if he finds out the source of the black magic, Rosalita could well cover for him. The magician immediately sets off to run in search of it. He thanks my lady for saving him. But Rosalita says that in any case, she asks that the maid who is standing next to her take something from her and take it away and forget all that has happened. The maid apologizes, but she screams that she won't accept it. She can't erase her memory just for some gold. Rosalita shows the bag of gold, and the maid takes the gold and wonders where it is. Rosalita is happy that everything is resolved. The day after the confusing situation, Rosalita returned home with her knight. Asterion was happy to have his sister back. Rosalita asks why Asterion went out. After all, the days are still very cold. The little brother replies that last night he went out too. But the Duke let it be known that Rosalita will arrive today. The protagonist asks her brother what is wrong with his face. Asterion replies that there is nothing wrong with it. The protagonist doesn't understand. Is her little brother deliberately making himself very cute? Every day he does research on how to be cuter. Aster asks, "Until when does the mistress intend to stand in this place?" Rosalita agrees with the knight and offers to come inside. She asks if Asterion is used to living in a separate building. The protagonist had a subtle, hovering feeling of déjà vu. The dark energy she felt in the Imperial Palace dungeon doors opened with magic and sword chains. For the sake of ending the endless rebirths of the fulfillment of a cherished wish of the real Rosalita. It is the fulfillment of Asterion's wish. To extend Asterion's life is not the end. Rosalita cries out and asks, "Does Asterion want nothing from his sister? Material or abstract something will do." Asterion asks for forgiveness. He never thought of such details. However, he says that he is happy with the mere possibility of spending time with his sister. Rosalita thinks that she has been hasty, so she agrees with her brother and tells Asterion to think slowly, and be sure to tell him if she shows up what she really wants. Take the Duke's seat, or cut off the head of bad partner number 1. For the sake of her little brother, Rosalita is willing to do anything. Asterion replies that when that time comes, he'll be sure to tell her. The protagonist turns to the knight and says that the head maid has not made sure that Asterion is not overworked. Therefore, she orders the knight to tell the head maid that Rosalita is depleting her wages. There's one more thing left for the protagonist to check. Aster is so sensitive to magical power that even without mistakenly being able to locate the cursed doll in the huge palace. But she didn't notice and didn't even say a word about the dungeon the protagonist was in. Rosalita went to that place again. But when she arrived, the door was open. Rosalita didn't understand why it was open, but when she went inside, she saw that in that place. There was no sword or chain. A few days later, Rosalita asked Aster if the sword could talk. Aster asks if the mistress is having a dream. He suggests a walk, but Rosalita replies that you don't talk to the knight now. But suddenly they see a luxurious carriage at the window again, and judging by the fact that the carriage is covered in gold, it's the royal carriage. Rosalita doesn't understand why the carriage has come, because the ball is over. The knight again picks up the protagonist in his arms and they start to run. Suddenly, the Duke and his butler reappear. Rosalita and the knight shout that they will win anyway, so the Duke should not even resist. When the protagonist and the knight go outside, they notice that the Duke's man has already taken the letter from the prince. The butler talks about how this is the experience of being an adult. The Duke asks in surprise, did his daughter really think she could pull off the same thing twice? Now the protagonist doesn't know what the letter says. The Duke reads the letter that came, and suddenly he holds it out to his daughter and says that Rosalita must decide. And the Duke completely agrees with his daughter's choice. Rosalita asks her father to tell her what it is first. It's a letter written with love from the royal palace from Queen Alan. The Queen writes that she hasn't seen Lady Larissa for a long time. She asks if the girl has been living well all this time. The Queen asks, let Rosalita not care that she personally decided to write her a few lines. Alain has heard that she recently had her son tortured by Lady Larissa at a ball. She understands the protagonist because her son is a rare beauty. So she thinks of torturing a young lady to repay her efforts. Elaine's got a pretty good list of suitors for her, and she's also added her son to it. So Rosalita might accidentally choose her son. The protagonist burns this letter. Written in the handwriting of the Queen herself, the letter is written on high-quality parchment and even uses the seal of the royal family. In such a case, it's impossible to refuse. This must be the Crown Prince's revenge on the protagonist. Aster suggests that the mistress go out for a walk today. When the protagonist and her knight go for a walk, Rosalita thinks about the fact that, honestly, her interest in the relationship of marriage has completely died after 65 years of life. Just spend a suitable partner to use as a laborer and live with him in separate rooms. After a while, you can offer monetary compensation and kick her out. And if there's a show, it's a perfect match. Someone who works well, obeys without question, and has wit. He has no opinion of his own. If the mood strikes him, he'll have fun. Among the sons of aristocrats, such a man doesn't exist. Suddenly, Rosalita notices a familiar face. In the garden sits Glenn Hofen. This man is also an aristocrat. Rosalita says that she has not seen Glenn Hofen for a long time. She asks if there is anything about the estate that makes him uncomfortable. Glenn Hofen replies that thanks to his mistress he is quite at ease. He is ready to answer her call at any time. Rosalita realizes that this guy is savvy. She asks which family Glenn Hofen belonged to before entering the duchy. The guy replies that it was the barony of Hofen, and after the head passed away, the name and lands of Hofen were taken over by the royal palace, then to the barony that used to own the lands. Although Glenn Hofen is not a perfect beauty, well, if he tried hard enough, he could rub the prince's nose in it. The lands of Hofen run between the capital and the province, so the transportation system is well established. It's not bad to add that Glenn Hofen is 20 years old this year. After all, it's said that 4 years apart in age, they don't even look at the stars for compatibility. Rosalita orders Glenn Hofen to follow her. The girl says that from now on, Glenn Hofen asks, "Does he really have to deal with the paperwork?" Rosalita replies that he does. When Glenn Hofen got to work, the main character was surprised. She didn't understand. Is the speed of the work unbelievable? She sees multiple hands, a level of 1,000 eyes and hands that even her father couldn't achieve. But the girl realizes it's too early. It's impossible to know for sure. After all, that same day Glenn Hofen said he had sorted out everything Lady Larissa had given him. Rosalita looked at all the documents, and she was surprised. And then the protagonist called the maids and ordered them to take the measurements of young Mr. Glenn Hofen, and the girth of his finger, too. Glenn Hofen didn't understand what was being done to him. Rosalita ordered the maid to contact the designer responsible for Astor's clothes, also to bring the hairdresser contracted by the duchy, and bring him to the young master, and the ring will be made gold. Now the protagonist is thinking about what stone to put in the ring. Rosalita just can't miss this man. The protagonist goes out into the hallway and asks the young gentleman if he likes diamonds. Glenn Hofen replies that he probably likes it. The guy doesn't understand why Rosalita is behaving so strangely. After all, she used to torture and ignore him. A week later, the maid tells the gentleman that the younger mistress asks to see him. Glenn Hofen thought that he would appear before the Duke in such a disgraceful state. In the end, Rosalita is going to sell him for nothing. The protagonist tells the guy that he is really handsome. Glenn Hofen asks the lady to stop joking. Rosalita replies that there's something interesting about the guy's abruptness, even when he's being complimented. After a while, the mistress is allowed to enter the Duke's office. Rosalita provides documents that the Duke believes were written by young Mr. Glenn Hofen. Rosalita provides a report showing all the cases that have been dealt with. The Duke replies that he will be the guardian. But suddenly, Rosalita kneels before Glenn Hofen and asks Glenn Hofen to marry her. The boy doesn't understand. He can't be dreaming. When Rosalita kneels, she accidentally knocks the staff out of the guy's hands. Rosalita forgot about the gift. The young master needed the cane the most. The girl apologizes to the young master. She says that she should have prepared a gift, even if it was small. But Glenn Hofen says that's not the problem. He says that no matter how insignificant a man he is, he should have at least pretended to ask the lady for her opinion. Rosalita replies that even if she asks, nothing will change anyway. Glenn Hofen replies that what mistress says is right, because everything has to go on, according to her plan. However, Glenn Hofen also has feelings and knows the word worth. Glenn Hofen refuses mistress's marriage proposal. He leaves and asks her to forgive him. Rosalita is surprised at what is happening, but the Duke orders his daughter to follow him. He says that Larissa's steadfastness can only be shaken by one thing: love, which is doing her job perfectly. But once Rosalita repents and speaks her heart, she is usually forgiven. Rosalita asks, "Is the Duke really saying this from personal experience?" Edward replies that it is how he got his daughter back from her mother's family. Rosalita decides to follow her father's example. A butler comes running after the protagonist. He says that no matter how offended the protagonist is, she should shut her mouth and be sure to say what she has done. Because if she doesn't answer and shuts up, it will have the opposite effect. Rosalita asks if that's true. The guy also has this from personal experience. At this time, young Mr. Glenn Hofen has fallen down in the corridor. Rosalita runs up to the guy and decides to help him. Glenhofen pushes the lady away and says he's fine. He replies that he wasn't far off, even though she made the suggestion with their situation in mind. Still shouldn't have said so beforehand. Glenhofen asks, "Did the girl really have a reason?" Rosalita decides to start by explaining the situation. She says that the conversation will take too long, so she offers to pass in his piece. Glenhofen asks, "Does Rosalita really know the location of his room?" Rosalita replies that of course she does. After all, the room is at the very end of the right-hand corridor on the 3rd floor. It has the most beautiful view. Glenhofen replies that he will listen to the girl first. After a while, Rosalita says that the approaching and only Glenhofen has received a threat from the imperial family demanding that he be married as soon as possible. And Rosalita confidently declares that she'll let the guy go. She will also return his status back to Baron and arrange for him to be the assistant to the Duke's heir. Glenhofen replies that it's definitely a win-win proposition for both sides. Rosalita doesn't understand. Does Glenhofen really think that she has caused all this chaos for nothing? Suddenly, Glenhofen asks how long he should fulfill the role of groom. Rosalita asks until she is 20 years old. Glenhofen knows that's another 4 years. Rosalita says she will be responsible for the guy's life even after the contract ends. When he remarries, that duchy will handle all the wedding expenses. The lad asks how his own likelihood is that it will harm his mother and Junior. Rosalita replies that he can assume the odds are 0. She'll protect everyone. Glenhofen understands. He accepts the protagonist's offer. Apparently, he's misunderstood everything so far, and says that even though it's a contractual relationship, she promises that she'll always protect him. As long as he is Rosalita Larissa's fiancé, no one will dare to neglect him. Glenhofen replies that there's something he'd like to ask. It's like he's glistening with embarrassment. And literally, a half-carat diamond. Rosalita replies to let the guy say whatever he wants. Glenhofen feels uncomfortable being called a young gentleman. He asks that Rosalita stop doing it. Rosalita puts a ring on herself and is pleased. She agrees with the guy. Glenhofen replies that he could have put the ring on himself, but Rosalita replies that she's done, and it doesn't make any difference. What matters is that today is their first day. In honor of the first day of their relationship, she suggests they go to work. A few hours later, Glenhofen tells my lady that he's finished. The main character was surprised at how fast the guy was. With this guy that has reached the level of 1,000 eyes and hands, Rosalita will be able to live a life every day in which there is a free evening. Anyone who laid a finger on Glenhofen would die. The protagonist is ready to go crazy. She says she's very pleased. The girl suggests that they go on a date tomorrow and buy a cane. Glenhofen replies that then he'll finish even faster tomorrow. The protagonist can't believe that Glenhofen can finish even faster. Rosalita asks to be looked at. She's out of her mind. It's time for her to go to dinner. She asks that Aster take care of the young lord and bring him in. Glenhofen wonders what the lady is going to do. At this time, Asterion is having dinner. Suddenly, she announces that the younger mistress is coming. Asterion is happy that his sister has come. At this time, Aster is carrying the young master in his arms. Suddenly, Asterion says that he will go first. Rosalita asks in surprise, "Is the younger brother no longer hungry?" Asterion apologizes and says that he has no appetite today. The boy starts to cry and runs away. Rosalita notices that something is wrong with the boy. It turns out that the protagonist's younger brother, full of thirst for monopolizing his sister, had a huge shock when he saw the pinned stone, aka groom. But Rosalita does not understand why suddenly she performed such a role. After some time, the protagonist went to her younger brother's room and asked if she could come in. Now the girl wonders why Asterion really loves his sister so much. Rosalita replies that since her younger brother does not answer her, she will enter the room herself. The sister comes in, and Asterion doesn't even greet her. The boy asks if her sister enjoyed the meal. The protagonist thinks that Asterion misunderstood something, so she came on purpose. The girl says she got engaged to Glenhofen because of pressure from the royal family. No other reason. Once the contract is up, Asterion has to help her. But he's already out of sorts over some petty things. Now the girl is worried. The conclusion is that Asterion is for the duration of the contract. and Asterion for life. Asterion cried and said that he was just surprised. Rosalita says it's all right. She brought the food. And now Asterion has to eat at least something. Asterion agrees with his sister. But when the boy started to eat, Rosalita realized that Asterion was very hungry. He asks his sister to listen. He talks about not having school tomorrow afternoon. He asks if he can work with them. Rosalita says that's a commendable thing to say. But tomorrow she's arranged to go out with Glenhofen to buy a cane, and Asterion stays home quietly for the time being. But in the end, Asterion went out with his big sister. After all, Rosalita can't say no to her little brother. But suddenly a guy stops them and asks them where they're going. Rosalita replies that they have things to do, and they're going out for a while. But the guy says that's a lie. Is Rosalita going to change the deception of the heavens? Because reality, under the pretext of not having things to do, she's going out to have fun. And it's obvious. Rosalita agrees and says that they're really going to have fun, but she wonders what the guy is going to do. Now the guy's asking to be taken along with them. After all, he does what he does every day to protect the main gate. This stubborn big brother Aster. Or his name is Carl Brown. Tolik Quill Brown, they're twins. That's why Rosalita can't tell them apart, but no matter how you turn it, it's one of the twins. The boy promises to tell the Duke. Rosalita replies that they will go together next time. Aster replies that they'll take his brother with them when he starts to come of age. After all, he's always making the same scene. Aster asks who's taking him with them, but Aster replies that the mistress asked her to tell her. She asks if she's done the right thing by mistress. At that moment, Rosalita strikes the knight, but Aster replies that she told the truth. The protagonist turns to this guard she doesn't know how to call him by his name because she still doesn't recognize Gemini and asks him to bear with her just for today. Next time she'll be sure to buy him a steak. Brown's people grew up in a house with a lot of people, so it's easy to bribe them with food. After a while, the protagonist opens the door and talks about how good this store must be. The salesman greets them and talks about how the protagonist, her friends, came to the store with the best canes. All the stuff in this place is incredibly expensive, and they can buy it if they can afford it. At that moment, the protagonist orders to give her various canes. The salesman does as the mistress orders. Glenhofen tells my lady that it's all a waste. Anything will do. Mistress replies that she's always. She does nothing but work. She doesn't spend money on anything. And at least on a day like this, she wanted to spend money heartily. Rosalita says that she only works and earns money from the day. But Glenhofen replies that he didn't mean anything by it. Now Glenhofen starts yelling that he wants new clothes. Also, Asterion is just amazing with the golden silk hat. Asterion talks about how the coat he's holding is incredibly odd, but very expensive, and should be given to the younger gentleman. Now there's more enthusiasm. This is how shopping is done. Having finally finished their productive shopping, they came to a cafe with a foot bath. The protagonist is happy because she had a very good time. Aster talks about how the cake she had is incredibly delicious. Asterion thinks about the fact that it seems Glenhofen and her little brother have gotten close and Aster is having fun. The girl is also having fun for the first time in a long time. Rosalita feels a pleasantness on her soul. All this time she has been rushing somewhere. And now the girl wonders, does she now need to add the healing genre to this novel? Suddenly, in the window that overlooks the garden, the protagonist notices two guys and starts kicking Glenhofen and Asterion out of the room, screaming that they should hide the men, and if they go out for life, they'll end up commas on the estate. Aster asks what's wrong with the mistress, but Rosalita replies that there is a dangerous man nearby. Rosalita asks Aster not to say useless words and to be quiet. Luke Chatel is the director of the global financial enterprise of the Chatel Corporation, of the Largol Empire, and head of a branch of the Kingdom of Alan. But none of that matters. He's not interested in women, in full compliance with the title, a true lover of women. And if he falls in love once, he'll stab you in the back, just to get love. After all, he killed Asterion in one of his lives. If he comes and flags Asterion and Glenhofen, he'll take them away from the protagonist. Because this is a novel. Rosalita is a girl, so she can't win. And now she and the Duke are people who can't live without Glenhofen. At that moment, the guy who came with Mr. Luke Chatel enters the room where the protagonist is. He apologizes and tells the lady that Mr. Luke has come. But Rosalita replies that if the guy apologizes, let him disappear. After all, Rosalita is enjoying her vacation. Aster is also worried, but at least she can prove she's a girl. Suddenly, this guy takes the mask off his face, and it turns out that Luke Chatel is standing in front of the protagonist. The guy says he can't follow what the girl says. Rosalita asks, "Is Luke Chatel really using every trick he can think of?" she asks. "Did the guy really learn it when he was a slave?" Luke Chatel replies that the girl may think that he just wanted to see him very badly. He also says that he is honored. The witch is interested in him enough to know his origins. Rosalita replies that she couldn't help but know. After all, Luke Chatel is quite the banner. Even when he is rejected, he breaks through by any means necessary and returns. Even when he is insulted, he takes it with an impossible smile. A professional of professionals. And if he was shaken by such a thing, he couldn't survive in the poisonous breed of the Chatel. Luke's homeland is the Lorgol Empire. That stretches across the sea, a barbaric country that invades neighboring countries and makes slaves of its captives. Unfortunately, Luke was the son of a slave. Even more unlucky for him, his own father is the head of the Chatel family of the Lorgol Empire. This trash for fun seduced Luke's mother, after which she gave birth to a son. The mother taught her son that survival comes first, and that surviving was the only way to get by, so Luke showed aptitude. But suddenly, Luke's father appeared in front of the son and his mother and offered an alternative. He offered to shorten his life and make Luke a legitimate son of the Chatel family, or to kill Luke and become a concubine of the Chatel family. But the mother knew that survival was paramount, and that staying alive was the only way to get by. The protagonist asks, if Luke Chatel and his mother were special, it begs the question of who would make a mother who kills her own child a concubine. From then on, the boy became Luke Chatel. Luke talks about how his mother was quite the busybody. The moment Luke's mother chose her own survival, his father stabbed her with a sword, and she died instantly. So Luke entered the Chatel family subjected to all kinds of neglect. The boy says he owes his mom a debt of gratitude. After all, it was thanks to her that he attracted the interest of Mrs. Rosalita. The boy has risen to the headmaster's seat, so Rosalita wants to torture him more. Rosalita says that Luke Chatel didn't learn etiquette from his mother. He came to meet his mistress. No luck before that duchy, and without going through the official line, the boy asks why the mistress is so cold. After all, he is only for the sake of friendship with Mistress Rosalita. The girl replies not to make the guy laugh. The incomparable Luke Chatel did it for friendship. Rosalita says the boy probably came with the intention of opening a business. He hasn't brought anything as a gift yet. But at that moment, Luke Chatel shows the protagonist the gifts. They were all different kinds of jewelry. But Rosalita tosses all the jewelry aside. She says that apparently the guy was without gifts. The girl used a laser kick. Her laser kick destroys lies with all kinds of interference and gets to the truth. All of this guy's jewelry was recently seen by the girl in a store nearby. She asks, does Luke Chatel think she's stupid to give her such an insincere gift? But Luke replies that he would never do such a thing. Fuck, because Mrs. Rosalita is a very perceptive person. Rosalita asks, should she really take it and go straight to Duke Larissa with it? Luke Chatel has spoken well so far, but she asks why all of a sudden the guy is silent. The girl knows him well. She suggests that as a businessman, businessmen do not beat around the bush. She suggests getting straight to the point. Luke Chatel replies that if that is the intention of the lady, Mrs. Rosalita will receive a gift. It would be of great benefit to her. A man's potential is immeasurable. No matter how hammer-like he may be, even as a flower bush, if someone dear to him is in danger, superhuman strength emerges. Suddenly, the closet where Asterion and Glenhofen were hiding opens, and Asterion asks if his sister is okay. The boy asks why Aster is just standing there being his sister's personal knight. Glenhofen yells for Mistress Rosalita to calm down. He doesn't understand what the big deal is about accepting a bit of jewelry. Luke replies that since it is a bracelet from Germany, it fits the body incredibly well. Suddenly, Rosalita throws herself at Glenhofen, and the guy apologizes. Luke Chatel says he doesn't know what's wrong, but he asks for the lady to calm down. Now the protagonist is pointing her knight in the direction of Glenhofen. Aster makes a snap of his finger. At this time, the protagonist is surprised. Luke Chatel has discovered the men after all, and she had hidden them safely away, fearing that Luke Chatel might have second thoughts. She did it. Now the girl asks Luke Chatel to be lenient, but Luke Chatel replies that the lady should calm down, for he too has such a thing as preference. And of course he will not accept a small child who hardly speaks yet, and a grown-up stupid man even if they are given to him. Rosalita doesn't understand what it is, because Luke Chatel is saying all the right things. But she has a strange feeling. The protagonist answers that this little child is her brother, and the stupid man is her fiancé. Luke Chatel is surprised. He says the little brother has a great future ahead of him, but as a fiancé, he can make the effort himself, so there won't be a problem. But Rosalita asks that the boy not even jokingly say such words. It's necessary with a permit to open a branch, and will issue an official authorization from the duchy. Luke doesn't understand why the lady would say such a thing, but he thanks her. He's also curious about something. Rosalita asks the guy to just say what he wants. After a while, the protagonist was sitting next to Luke Chatel, and their feet were in the pool. Rosalita asks how at only 16 years old she is so knowledgeable in business matters. Luke Chatel replies that he has been treading water for over 10 years. The girl replies that she has that too. In order to tell Luke about herself, the girl had no other choice but to narrate the deep darkness and the terrible history of the Duchy of Larissa. When the heir to the Duchy of Larissa turns 10 years old, the heir's education begins with a 5-year plan. Further details are removed. In any case, Rosalita spent a time similar to A, when pounded into her head for 5 years. Necessary knowledge of the internal and higher state of affairs in the country. And if you vomit constantly without eating, a pink liquid comes out. Answers that it's the mucous membrane of the stomach. Rosalita replies that Luke Chatel is well aware of the rules. But in any case, she and the Duke are not going to consider a price of less than 4 trillion imperial currency for the lease. She asks that Luke Chatel make sure he doesn't forget anything. She promises to cut the price a bit if the guy brings gold in bullion. Luke Chatel replies that he'll have it taken away. Rosalita asks if the guy will stay a little longer, but Luke replies that he stopped by this place on his way to another place. The guy saw the mistress and got permission to open a branch, so he is waiting for new business. But suddenly Glenn Hofen shows up and asks, does the boy think he can get away with it? Glenn Hofen yells for Mrs. Rosalita not to let the guy go. Glenn Hofen asks if the mistress noticed something odd about this guy's statement. And everybody's missing it. It's about Glenn Hofen being a stupid man. Rosalita says it's not weird at all. But Luke Chatel says that in other words, it means that the young gentleman has experience. Glenn Hofen replies that it's nothing like that. Luke Chatel seems to understand. He says there's a reason Glenn Hofen can be so good mentally. Rosalita doesn't understand why Glenn Hofen is silent. She orders the boy to speak quickly. After all, she's already starting to get dizzy. Glenn Hofen starts yelling and talking about how he can't do it. He's the groom. It is said that after this incident, it took a full 24 hours before Glenn Hofen spoke to Rosalita again. After some time, the official appointment as Aster Brown's personal knight happened. The knight was undoubtedly overjoyed. Rosalita cried out that he was her best knight. The maid pleaded for her mistress to calm down, but Rosalita continued to scream. The ever-delayed ceremony for Aster's knighthood is now inaugurated. The 3rd son of the Brown family is congratulated by Aster. Also, the 4th son of the Brown family, Jack Brown, is congratulated by Aster. The 5th son of the Brown family and the 6th son of the Brown family also congratulates his sister. Or not. But the twin brother replies that if Carla is hesitant to congratulate, I'd rather congratulate. Aster is grateful to everyone. The first day after Aster's knighthood ceremony, Aster ate and said it was delicious. But Rosalita turned to the knight and said she found a new combat instructor. On weekday afternoons, the knight must take a break from his duties and attend training with Asterion. Rosalita hands the knight a schedule. There's the training. Suddenly, Aster starts crying and asks, is it because she eats too much? But Rosalita replies that it's not. It's because she's sorry to waste her talent as a knight. Rosalita asks, doesn't Aster remember the day of the ball? At the royal palace, the knight sensed the dark energy, even earlier than the protagonist. When Aster trains herself to a level where she can use the aura, everything will get better. Aster asks, Didn't Rosalita want to cut her down due to her huge spending on food? Rosalita asks, does Aster really think the duchy is pauperized? Apparently her personal knight therefore just has to rise to the occasion. Aster replies that she understands. In a short period of time, she promises to return to normal and master the aura. But she asks if she will also protect the protagonist if she is gone. Aster says that if the choice of the protagonist does not convince her, the knight will not be able to advance in his training either. Rosalita replies that she has someone on the subject. Rosalita wants to say it's Jack Brown, but Aster replies that let it be anything but her brother. She'd rather ask Mr. Glenn Hofen than have her brother protect her mistress, but she takes it back. After all, Glenn Hofen is not a man, but one big time. But Rosalita says she's made up her mind anyway. She's thought it over. Aster asks, is there no one else in their line but Jack? Rosalita replies that she picked and chose everything with her electronic brain, and with Quinn having to stand guard. Someone is doing a job outside the duchy. Aster replies that she understands the mistress. She promises to eat quickly and grow up to get back to work in a flash. Aster talks about how she has no one in her family. Larissa's estate dungeon holds another secret, a place where people are quietly dealt with on the authority of the duchy. Jack Brown, who works there, is the executioner. When the protagonist and Aster went down into the dungeon, there was a horrible smell. Aster replied that it was the perfect place for the garbage that lived there. Suddenly, the protagonist starts calling for Jack. It's the same guy the protagonist was looking for, Jack Brown. Jack gets excited and asks, is Rosalita finally going to kill Aster? But the heroine replies that she isn't. Jack asks, is there someone he needs to deal with? But Rosalita replies that there isn't. Now Jack wonders why the mistress has come in that case. Aster suggests the mistress leave. Rosalita tells him that Aster will be busy with other things for a while, so the knight's place is empty, and she says that for a short period, Jack Brown will protect her. But the couple doesn't reply that he doesn't want to do that. Rosalita says that if Jack doesn't want to be fired, then he should listen to the end. Jack replies that it's up to the Duke to fire him or not, but Rosalita says that he is permanently locked in the dungeon. Apparently, Jack doesn't know that she has become the Duke's heiress. Jack starts to rejoice and yells that since Rosalita is the heiress, she should have told him earlier. But the girl orders the boy to listen to her carefully. Rosalita says that either he will be banished and lose the opportunity to kill legally for life, or he will temporarily serve as her knight. Jack asks which timeline the mistress is talking about. Rosalita replies that it is until Aster can use the sword aura. Jack assumes that Aster won't be able to do that for the rest of his life. The protagonist pounces on the guy and punches him in the face with her fist. She asks how the guy knows this. Jack replies that he means that he failed to do it, and the rest of the brothers failed as well. Rosalita replies that she represents another teacher for Aster. For a while, Aster won't be able to be her knight at all. Jack doesn't understand why Rosalita invests in a child who eats all day long. But Rosalita screams that if she said it, they must do it. The witch is the Duke's heir, and she promises to turn the place upside down if she gets angry. So Rosalita peacefully replaced her personal knight. After a while, Aster asks her why she doesn't eat and keeps rolling around on the ground. In response, Jack asks, does Aster really care about food even under these circumstances? Suddenly, going outside, Rosalita notices the Duke, who calls the protagonist his favorite daughter. And now the girl wonders what happened to her father. After such words, Knight Aster and Jack pounced on the Duke. They stretched out their swords. But the Duke also says he wants to live. Rosalita asks why the Duke has been acting so strangely. She thought he was a spy. The Duke asks if it is strange that the father speaks of his love for his daughter. Rosalita knows what the Duke is up to. His intentions are obvious. After all, Rosalita is a person who has lived at 60-44 years. That's 16 years, which means she knows everything there is to know at that age. And soon there will be a ball event with a definite date. Not everyone is invited, as in the case of ordinary favors, but only those with special rights. And it turns out the Duke will definitely be there. The young Mr. Glenn Hofen is important at this ball. Rosalita must introduce him. Rosalita says that the Duke knows that the Queen has personally entrusted her with the choice of a groom for the engagement. The Duke becomes angry, but he realizes he can't make an angry face, and if he gives in, he'll go anyway. After all, His daughter knows the reason. The Duke asks, "Did Rosalita really think he'd do this to his daughter?" He says it's a joke. It's an opportunity to mock His Highness the Prince, and he can't miss it. He says they'll all go to the ball together. Rosalita asks what about the overtime, but the Duke decides to give it all to Louis. Rosalita asks, did her father convince her uncle to do it? But the Duke replies that wisely chosen words can raise an entire rebellion. Rosalita rejoices and thinks the Duke is the best. Edward says that his Duchess is never boring. Rosalita says that, as expected, the Duke is the leader of their duchy with a wealth of life experience and overwhelming wisdom.